Hi there, we're back for season 3 of One in a Billion, a show about China, one person at a time.
My Chinese name is Dai Sancai, 叫戴就是爱戴的戴. So I am 28 years old and I am from Northern California, actually from Berkeley originally.
That's Zak Dychtwald, a fascinating young American author and consultant who wanted to understand China by living like a Chinese.
I was trying desperately hard to live more like a young Chinese person than an American.
For 4 years, he was living in tenements, basements, hostels, and high-rises all across China.
I wanted people to know about the ordinary, the average person, what they were hoping for, what they were dreaming of, what they wanted for themselves, their family, their country, what kept them up at night.
His book, Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World, will be the focus in part 2 of my interview with Zak. Now in part 1, you'll hear about Zak's own struggle to grow up and to find his place in the world. But why go to China? Why can't he do that in America? And what is it like to live this Chinese life as a 28-year-old American in China? I'm Mabel Chan, and this is One in a Billion. So walk me back to that day, that moment when you decided, okay, I'm moving to China. What were you thinking?
So it was senior year. I had just come back from 6 months in Hong Kong, which were, without a doubt, not just the most adventurous of my life, but the most fun of my life. And then through my travels throughout mainland China, it was just so intoxicating to me that even when I came back, I would wake up every day and think, okay, this is cool. I was working at an international advertising firm in their global strategy department. But even still, I would wake up every day and think, this is cool. Wouldn't it be cooler if I was waking up in China?
What was intoxicating about it? What did you remember?
I remember the feeling that anything is possible. To the young people there, this sense of aspiration, this sense of perpetual change. And if you could just find an open window, make your space amongst that sort of torrid pace of change, then you could really grab onto something large. You could create something impactful, something big.
That was Zak speaking about his 20-year-old self as a college student who had never been to Asia before.
I grew up in the Bay Area, just outside of Berkeley, so in a really small town that was primarily white and actually East Asian, very not international, not global. When I first went to Columbia freshman year for university, I remember marveling at how far away and how big city New York felt. So I think of myself as a really small town kid.
This really small town kid would be drawn to big personality and deep philosophy since he was 11 years old. One night, when he was home alone with Dad, they turned on the movie Enter the Dragon, starring Bruce Lee.
Teacher?
I see your talents have gone beyond the mere physical level. Your skills are now at the point of spiritual insight.
A good martial artist does not become tense, but ready. Not thinking, yet not dreaming. Ready for whatever may come. When the opponent expands, I contract. When he contracts, I expand. And when there is an opportunity, I do not hit. It hits all by itself.
That was the first sort of awakening to, wow, this is kind of cool, which sounds like a cheesy first step into China, but Bruce Lee he was my first introduction to a Chinese protagonist. He was one of my heroes. You know, as you're growing up, you sort of start to collect people who you look up to. And Bruce Lee, this idea of the philosopher, adventurer, assertive person. I remember him also describing the idea of being like water when he was training one of his disciples. Again, these are all early scenes.
Be formless, shapeless, like water, like water, like water, like water, like water. Water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
And the idea that, you know, flexibility, fluidity, as a young person, I used to do a lot of sports. The idea that you could have this sort of philosophical athlete really appealed to me.
So Bruce Lee was one of Zak's heroes until he was about 17. At that age, he began thinking about college and major.
I was a literature student at Columbia. I did literature and business with psychology sprinkled throughout. Chinese lit introduced me to a new way of thinking, how our cultures impact the way we think. And this idea that it could be different from one place to the other was totally engrossing.
When time came for him to make choices about his own future, his longtime passion for science fiction would take him to a brand new world.
When I was younger, I was a big science fiction fan, and everyone told me that the future would be taking place in China. So I wanted to go and take a look for myself.
Remember, he just graduated from Columbia University? Many college graduates need a job right away to pay off student loans, pay back their parents, or support a family. It was obvious to me Zak didn't have to worry about any of those things. Not right away, anyway.
My mom is a total worrier, and she thought her son was going to go to the China that she had read about, which is often very scary. But what I sort of told them was I would go for a year, learn the language.
He also told them what they wanted to hear.
I would either join a firm, before I made the decision, I was sort of interviewing at the Bains and BCGs, the sort of classic, I don't know what I'm doing, but want to feel productive sorts of companies. I said maybe I'd join one of these consultancies afterwards. And my parents sort of took that bait.
Zak was smart. He put his parents at ease before he put himself through the trial by fire.
I wanted to be in it, to feel the fears, to understand the excitement, to sort of get the heartbeat of the place. And so I went without a job. I went with a one-way ticket. I didn't know anybody. I had chosen the place sort of randomly. I literally boarded the train with a backpack and the address of a hostel in Suzhou. My goal was to grow up alongside sinking into China.
Zak was deeply aware of his white privilege.
I was worried about being a soft suburban kid who went to a good school and got a job because he went to a good school. And I would sort of ride that track and never challenge myself. I really wanted to challenge myself.
He began with learning the language, something he said he wasn't good at before going to China, but
I recognized that Chinese was without a doubt the most important tool to understanding the place and the people. How are you gonna claim to understand someone if you can't talk to them?
His first year in Suzhou was a test of his willpower to live like a Chinese. Besides programming his phone and computer settings in Chinese,
I was living in a basement apartment for about $150 a month with a Chinese roommate. One of the things I realized was that to be a foreigner in China now, especially in a city like Suzhou, you don't need to speak Chinese. So this idea that you'll just be immersed by being there is sort of bogus. And I realized I had to create an environment where it would be immersive. I would only go to places where I knew I would be the only foreigner. So I had one restaurant that I would go to almost every day.
What would he eat every day?
So mostly Hong Xiao Rou. They had Hong Xiao Rou Mian, which is really good. So red cooked pork noodles. I ate that almost every day. I had a strict budget of $5 a day for food.
That was his first year, which we now know had turned into 4 years. What was that turning point?
I remember where I was. I was on the roof of a sort of hostel/inn in Chengdu when I realized I was constantly conversational in Chinese. And that was when I decided that there is no way that I can give this up.
That sounds to me his Chinese conversational ability has become a big part of his identity. And what he would not give up, and perhaps even take pride in, was his lifestyle.
Give you an idea of what kind of places these were. I'd make a decision at that point in my life whether or not the bunk bed, the balsa wood bunk bed I'd be sleeping on was $2 or $2.50. Times were tight, but I loved it.
So what was he doing to support himself?
So I was teaching English on the weekends at sort of upscale technology schools. I was teaching at nights during the week to young professionals who were trying to upgrade their careers. I would teach SAT, ACT. And then as my Chinese got better and as I moved to Chengdu, I started doing bilingual event hosting. I started doing freelance consulting, a good amount of writing for companies back in the United States who were trying to imagine how young people were seeing the world in China.
And of course, Zak would travel all over China. In the first year, he spent more than 200 hours on trains and buses. He would strike small talks and make friends along the way.
I met a friend in Chongqing, and I realized it was the first friendship I'd really formed in China that was built more around our similarities than our differences.
Tell me more about that. What are the similarities?
First, the differences. I think the differences are important because early on, for most friendships formed in China, it's, okay, I'm from America, you're from China. That's different. Isn't that weird? I do things this way, you do things that way. That's different. Isn't that weird? Later on, once you're able to start talking about feelings, how you see the world, how you dream of things, what you hope for, is when you can start to really focus on the similarities. And about 9 months in, with a young guy named Huan, that was my very first friendship that was based on those similarities. I'm a human, you're a human. I'm a young guy, you're a young guy. We're just dreaming of what we're going to try to build for ourselves in this world.
What were you obsessed about? Was it about relationship, about money, about job, dating?
You know, when you're 22, you're always freaking out about some date or another. And Huan would describe to me that he had just broken up. We spent 3 hours that night talking about his ex and talking about, sort of maybe the family that he was imagining forming and what his parents thought. Our understanding of women, our understanding of marriage even, was different, but was equally sort of romantic. We had this idea of what we wanted, and we didn't have it yet.
So your friend is Chinese, and presumably he was dating Chinese. How about you? Have you dated Chinese women? How would you describe your experience?
So I've never talked about my romantic life on recorded before. So this is a first for me. I have dated Chinese women, of course. I lived in China, and I really was trying to make every single part of my life sort of code switch into Chinese. And of course, that means dating Chinese women.
But here's the thing with Zak. He deliberately avoided dating Chinese women who were actively seeking a relationship with a foreigner. He wanted an intellectual and emotional connection first.
I was in Chengdu. I was 25, and there was this young woman who I had actually hosted an event with. I was a bilingual event host to make a little money while I was working on my book at that point. And I fell head over heels for her. She was interesting. She was insightful. She was thoughtful. She was curious. She was interested in seeing the world. She had never left Sichuan before. And we just spent an enormous amount of time talking with one another. After a little while, it became clear that she was having similar feelings for me. And then one day she described what she imagined for herself, what she dreamed of. And it was a family in a small town outside of Chengdu. In the next 2 years or so, she would start a small plant farm. So a place where you would grow plants for different museums and corporations, but something small, something local. And that was it. And she wanted to start now, more or less. And she described to me being close to her parents. She described to me being unable to leave them. She described the importance of forming a family and doing it young. And very little of what she described was compatible with where I saw myself in 2 years. And that was a moment where I really grew up. We made a decision that the things that we were wanting, not just that year, I wanted more than anything to date this young woman, but what we wanted for the rest of our lives. And by that metric, we were incompatible. So we had to say goodbye.
That young woman who had never left her hometown had a specific vision for her future. One that is linked to her family and their future well-being. When I was 25 years old, like most Americans that age, I was still figuring out who I was and what I wanted to make of my life. In this American life, we can take our time, but not in China. Zak told me that's why he left China at that point 3 years ago. He's living in New York now on a speaking tour around America, but he plans to move back to China next year. In our next episode, part 2, Zak's insights on the 20-something Chinese in China. How would you describe your generation, the 20-something in China?
4 words: aspirational, pressured, restless, proud.
That's next week. 1 in a Billion is
Brian Latwinowicz,
Sarah Zhu, Yvette Yu,
and our lovely theme song is composed by Brad McCarthy. Let us know if you want to join our team of volunteers, help us plan events, pitch a story. Just go to our new website, oneinaBillionVoices.org, and find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Support for our podcast comes from our collaboration with the Victor and William Fung Foundation.